For about 7 million Americans, it was a day like any other. They were doctors, engineers, taxi drivers, teachers, and small business owners. They were raising families in suburbs from Dearborn, Michigan to Irvine, California. They were a diverse, often invisible community, a mosaic of immigrants from Pakistan, Egypt, and Indonesia, alongside a deeply rooted African American population. They were Muslims, and they were, for the most part, quietly living the American dream. September 11, 2001. In the space of a few horrific hours, everything changed. As the Twin Towers fell, a spotlight of unimaginable intensity suddenly swiveled and fixed itself upon them. Their faith, their identity, and their loyalty to their country were all thrown into question overnight. They went from being just another thread in the American tapestry to being the subject of intense fear, suspicion, and scrutiny. The story of Islam in America is a long one, but it has a clear dividing line, before 9/11s and after 9/11s. Today, we explore how the single greatest trauma of the 21st century didn't destroy a religion in the United States, but paradoxically forged it into something new, something more resilient, more organized, and more assertively American than ever before. This is the story of how 9/11s created American Islam. Title card: somber, respectful typography over a backdrop of an American flag interwoven with geometric Islamic art patterns. American Islam: how 9/11s changed a religion in the United States. To understand the earthquake of 9/11s, you first have to understand the landscape before the ground started shaking. The American Muslim community of the late 20th century was a story of quiet growth and integration. It was one of the most ethnically diverse religious communities in the entire country. You had South Asian doctors in Ohio, Arab grocers in Brooklyn, West African taxi drivers in Washington, D.C., and a large, historic community of African American Muslims whose roots went back generations, connected to figures like Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. But this diversity was also a kind of fragmentation. A mosque in a Yemeni neighborhood might have little connection to one in a Bosnian community just a few miles away. The focus was local: building a mosque, starting a weekend school for the kids, finding halal butchers, and establishing a life in a new country. Politically, the community was relatively quiet and unorganized on a national level. For the most part, they were invisible to the wider American public. Most Americans knew very little about Islam, and what they did know was often filtered through distant conflicts in the Middle East. But their neighbors? They were just the Ahmads down the street, the quiet family whose kids played on the same soccer team. The primary identity was often tied to the country of origin. They were Pakistani Americans or Egyptian Americans who happened to be Muslim. Their Americanness was a given, a work in progress. Then, the planes hit. And in the fiery wreckage, that quiet progress came to an abrupt and brutal halt. In the immediate aftermath of the attacks, American Muslims felt a complex, triple trauma. First, as Americans, they felt the shock, grief, and horror of the attack on their country. They watched the towers fall with the same disbelief as everyone else. They lost loved ones too: first responders, office workers, passengers on the planes. Second, they felt a profound sense of betrayal and disgust that the perpetrators had committed this atrocity in the name of their religion, hijacking its symbols and language to justify mass murder. And third, they felt a cold, creeping dread. They knew what was coming, and it came swiftly. A wave of anti-Muslim backlash swept the country. Mosques were vandalized and firebombed. Sikh men, mistaken for Muslims because of their turbans, were attacked and even killed. Women wearing the hijab were spat on in grocery stores. The FBI reported that anti-Muslim hate crimes skyrocketed by over 1,600% from 2000 to 2001. Then came the government response. The Patriot Act was passed, granting sweeping new powers of surveillance. Thousands of Muslim men, mostly of Arab and South Asian descent, were subjected to special registration, rounded up, detained, and in many cases, deported, often for minor immigration violations. Mosques, student groups, and charities were infiltrated and monitored by law enforcement. Suddenly, being Muslim in America meant you were a suspect. The media became an echo chamber of suspicion. Pundits and so-called terrorism experts dominated the airwaves, painting Islam as a monolithic, violent ideology. Every aspect of the faith was put on trial in the court of public opinion. What is jihad? What is Sharia law? Why do your women cover their heads? The community was under siege, facing a level of hostility and suspicion that was unprecedented in its history. The old model of quiet integration was no longer an option. To survive, they had to change. This intense pressure cooker environment forced a profound transformation within the American Muslim community. It was a change born of necessity. First, it sparked a crisis of identity, which led to a conscious redefinition. The old, hyphenated identities began to feel inadequate. In a climate where their loyalty was constantly questioned, they made a powerful shift. They stopped being Muslim Americans and started being American Muslims. It's a subtle change in word order, but it's a monumental change in meaning. It placed their American identity front and center. It was a declaration. We are not a foreign community living in America. We are an American community that practices the faith of Islam. Our Americanness is not conditional. Second, a new generation of leaders emerged. The old guard, often first-generation immigrants, were sometimes hesitant to engage with the media and politics. But their children, young people who had grown up in America, who had gone to American schools, who only knew this country as their home, stepped forward. They were fluent in the language of American civil rights, media, and politics. Organizations like CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations, became more prominent. New voices, academics, activists, lawyers, and artists emerged, ready to challenge the stereotypes and define their own narrative on national television and in the halls of Congress. Third, the community was forced to look inward and confront the extremist ideology that had been used to justify 9/11s. Mosques and religious leaders across the country began to proactively and forcefully condemn terrorism. They also began to articulate a vision of Islam that was explicitly and unapologetically compatible with American values. They emphasized Islam's traditions of pluralism, social justice, and intellectual inquiry. They highlighted verses in the Quran about tolerance and protecting the innocent. This wasn't necessarily a new interpretation of Islam, but the emphasis was new. It became a public education campaign, a conscious effort to rebrand Islam for an American audience and, just as importantly, for their own children. They were defining what American Islam would stand for, an Islam that was progressive, democratic, and deeply patriotic. This internal transformation led to a new era of external engagement. The fragmented community of the 1990s began to organize and unify like never before. Mosques that had once served only their own ethnic communities started to open their doors. They hosted open mosque days, inviting their non-Muslim neighbors to come in, share a meal, and ask questions. Interfaith dialogue, which had been a niche activity, became a pillar of community life. Muslims built strong coalitions with Jewish, Christian, Sikh, and other minority groups, finding common cause in the fight against religious bigotry and for civil liberties. This coalition building extended to politics. Before 9/11s, Muslims were not a cohesive voting bloc. After 9/11s, galvanized by issues of civil rights, surveillance, and foreign policy, they became one of the most politically engaged communities in the country. Voter registration drives became common at mosques. They began to run for office, from local school boards to the U.S. Congress, and win. They learned to leverage their power, to lobby, to advocate, and to demand a seat at the table. They realized that in America, if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. The result of this two-decade-long transformation is the American Muslim community we see today. More visible, more vocal, more organized, and more integrated into the American political and social fabric than ever before. The terrible irony is that the attack designed by Osama bin Laden to spark a war between Islam and the West had the opposite effect within the United States. It forced American Muslims to double down on their American identity, to build bridges, and to create a version of Islam that is undeniably, resiliently, and proudly American. The trauma of 9/11s and its aftermath is not over. Islamophobia remains a real and dangerous force. But the attack failed to isolate or break the community. Instead, it forged it. So, when we look at the American Muslim experience, we see a powerful lesson about how minority communities respond to crisis, how pressure can forge identity, how suspicion can breed activism, and how a moment of national tragedy can, over time, lead to a deeper and more complex understanding of what it means to be an American. What do you think? Is this story of transformation of a community finding its voice in the face of adversity a uniquely American one? What other communities have had similar experiences? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this exploration of modern American history valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that look beyond the headlines. Thanks for watching.